let's go through the big races: New York, New Jersey, Virginia.
If you watch kind of national media at the top line, what you're going to hear is Christie, Christie, Christie. But the reality is Christie was the outlier yesterday. If you look across the country, it was a quite remarkable off-year election. Usually in the second term of a president, the other party does very, very well in these elections. It's a way for people to kind of let off steam. And instead, the fact of the matter is Democrats won, it looks like they may have won every major office in Virginia. The Attorney General's race there is still very close. They definitely won governor. They definitely won lieutenant governor. It's almost a tie on Attorney General. But the last time that happened in the second term of a Democratic president, the Democratic president was Franklin Roosevelt.
But even with Chris Christie, just a quick comment. Let's remember that the race for the Senate, Cory Booker, he could have had, right, he made it 2 weeks before, costing New Jersey $25 million. Chris Christie made it not on his day, because if Cory Booker were running on his day, first of all, his name would have been first running for Senate, and more Democrats would have come out. And it was never a question whether Chris Christie would win, but the news is the landslide he won by, and it sounds like he was very concerned about not winning by that landslide. So he spent $25 million to ensure this landslide.
No, he didn't spend it. The taxpayers did. But this is a false premise on so many levels. Understand this as well. Chris Christie forged relationships with South Jersey Democrats to kind of have people stand down. So the end result was he did everything he could to manufacture a headline. And as Bob McChesney and I write about a lot, our national media is like it's like the dog with the bone, so you throw that headline out and they go to it. But the fact is, 2 weeks ago in New Jersey, Chris Christie had a 33-point lead. Turns out he wins by about 20 points. So at the close of the race, when people started paying attention, the much neglected Democratic candidate there, Barbara Buono, actually came up somewhat, not trying to paint a fantasy picture here, but at the same time, Democrats kept control of the state legislature, and this, I think, is the big deal. The minimum wage increase that Chris Christie vetoed won by the same percentage of the vote that he won. New Jersey was style over substance. The substance of the New Jersey result is that people actually voted against what Chris Christie stands for in all the other races. So that's your gubernatorial top-line stuff. But I really would say that if we're going to be honest about what happened yesterday, the great story, the remarkable story of it is that union-backed populists won big city races, and we haven't had a lot of that in our history. We got not just Bill de Blasio, who got a decent amount of attention, not as much as he deserves. I mean, he should be right up there of the three top. It should be Virginia, New Jersey, New York. But then also Marty Walsh up in Boston. That was a whomping big deal race. Marty Walsh kind of squeaked through the primary there. It was a very crowded primary. And he was attacked all over the place by people who said, oh, this guy's a former union leader. He was the head of the building trades. He couldn't possibly be a fair player as mayor of Boston. You never hear that about a CEO, right? A CEO coming in, oh yeah, they can run a city, they know how to run it like a business. But because he came out of the unions, he was literally, in much of the media, attacked. They created a video up there that showed him at a rally protesting Scott Walker's policies in Wisconsin and said, do you want this kind of person as your mayor? Well, Boston decided they did want that kind of person as their mayor. It was a big deal victory, and you combine that with some of the minimum wage increases, the CTAC win, for the $15 minimum wage in Seattle. I think that's a sub-story that's really important.
But you've also suggested that some of these Democratic wins might suggest that Republicans are no longer contenders at all in urban America. Could you explain?
I think this is a really fascinating thing. I'm a historian, to some extent, of the moderate Republican and liberal Republican tradition, which I think is a very valid part of American history. And not that long ago, if we had an election night like this, an off-year election, we'd be talking about urban Republicans winning. A Mike Bloomberg, a Rudy Giuliani, going back, a John Lindsay, Arlen Specter, who came out of the Philadelphia Republican.
De Blasio, Democrat, won for the first time in 20 years.
Yeah, and really, when you look back at it, Republicans did very, very well in urban races. Now, look at this. L.A., which used to have a Republican mayor, has a relatively liberal Democratic mayor. New York has a Democratic mayor. In fact, I think you have to go down to like the 12th or 13th largest city to find a Republican. The Republicans have abandoned big cities. look, here's a party that's cutting food stamps, that's cutting shared revenues, that's cutting services, and their message is we're just not interested in these people anymore. And I think it's started to really come back on Republicans at the urban level. Joe Lhota in New York tried desperately, literally said,
the Republican candidate.
Yes, he literally said in debates, I'm not a national Republican. I'm not one of these guys. But it didn't take.
But he also went to Staten Island to court the Tea Party.
I'm not trying to make the case for the guy, but what I'm telling you is that I think the Republican Party's abandonment of urban America has really come back to haunt it electorally, and we saw that really played out last night.
Bill de Blasio kept talking about bringing back a progressive agenda. Let's go back to his speech, his victory speech last night.
The best and the brightest are born in every neighborhood. We all have a shared responsibility and a shared stake in making sure their destiny is defined by how hard they work and how big they dream, and not by their zip code. So when we call on the wealthiest among us to pay just a little more in taxes to fund universal pre-K and after-school programs, we aren't threatening anyone's success. We are asking those who've done very well to ensure that every child has the same opportunity to do just as well as they have. That's how we all rise together.
Taxing the rich. This is Bill de Blasio. He kept repeating it. He also spoke at Occupy in 2011.
Yeah. And so did the new public advocate, Tish James, actually joined a suit as regards the handling of Occupy on the side of the demonstrators. I mean, New York it's pretty close to an Occupy victory here, or at least something that had respect for it. And the thing about Bill de Blasio last night was he held that victory party not in Manhattan, but in Brooklyn. That's a message about the whole of this city, not just those zip codes with the higher incomes. And he also, in the midst of the speech, I thought one of the most remarkable things I've seen, he went straight into Spanish. And I'll admit, maybe his Spanish isn't perfect, but boy, I found that I cover a lot it politics.
And it wasn't just a line.
No, he went on, and I found it one of those rare moments in politics where it wasn't what you said as much as what you did. And I think it had a profound impact. But that taxing the rich thing, let me tell you, National Democrats, who are like usually the slowest people in the world to catch up with anything, really ought to pay a little attention to this. Bill de Blasio was attacked yesterday, or 2 days ago. The New York Post headline had a hammer and sickle on it. They were basically saying, this guy's Moscow's candidate. Everything they could do to attack the guy, and yet people saw through that, and they recognized that what he was talking about was a necessary way to deal with an austerity moment. And the other thing is, if you look out in Seattle, Shama Savant, who ran out there, she was an open socialist running saying $15 minimum wage, millionaire tax, no austerity cuts. She got 46% of the citywide vote for city council. So what I'm telling you is that when I look across this country, I'm seeing results that say that people are really ready to look at an alternative to austerity. They want something different than just cut, cut, cut. And there is an alternative. It is a fair tax policy, and that's what de Blasio talked about.
But could you talk about the role of money in the elections, even if all of these Democrats won? I mean, Christie, obviously Republican, had a 6-to-1 advantage compared to his rival, and Bill de Blasio also raised far more money than Joe Lhota did. So could you explain in that, as well as in the GMO labeling and other...
Yeah, that's the ugly part of it. I mean, when we talk about politics, we have to operate on many, many different levels and see many, many different aspects of it. So you can look across this country and say that people desperately are trying to send signals to their politicians, even against the money power. But the money power was very, very much in play. Dollarocracy was on the march yesterday. The two gubernatorial candidates who won, McAuliffe in Virginia and Christie in New Jersey, were both candidates that the business communities in their state were very, very supportive of them. Both of them had real financial advantages. And as you go across the country, you're going to see that two realities. Number one, usually the person with the most money won. and often a lot more money. That money often came from outside the community where the race was going on. And also, the most important thing is that even in the city level, we're starting to see these independent expenditures. We're starting to see money flowing from all sorts of different sources, not always well tracked. So that's reality. But you were so smart to focus in on that GMO labeling thing in Washington State. That is the ugliest manifestation of dollarocracy. Because here you have a Western state that produces a lot of food, and also, frankly, that has I think it's fair to say, in Washington State, around Seattle and other communities, a sensibility that, wants to have good, healthy, safe food. Now, I'm not even getting in the GM debate, but my point is that people want, generally polling, if you just ask people casually, yeah, they'd like to know, they'd like a label, and yet $22 million in outside money came in, and this was a transactional investment. You saw the largest food manufacturers in America literally coughing up $2 million, $3 million chunks of money into this pool to defeat a simple label on your food products. And when there was one study that suggested that of that $22 million, under $1,000 came from inside Washington. And it was just outside money pouring in to warp the democracy of a state.
The significance of these pot measures across the country.
Well, I think it's one of the wonderful things about democracy, when you actually give people a chance to vote on some of the issues which we're told so often in our media are still controversial and divisive. They're not. The fact of the matter is that in Portland, Maine, and I was up there, I actually talked to folks who were doing this thing. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have some sort of big, multi-million-dollar campaign. These were grassroots folks who, had tried to do a statewide law and had not gotten all the progress they'd wanted statewide. So they put this thing on the ballot in Portland. They won 67% of the vote. It was a landslide. And the fact of the matter is that in places across this country, when you say to voters, look, we want to either decriminalize or legalize marijuana, the response of voters is, yeah, it's time. It's much like the marriage equality issue. It took the political class and the media class a long time to catch up with the reality that the arc of history had, in fact, bent toward justice. On marijuana, you have a remarkable combination of factors. One is a lot of people who just don't think it's as scary a thing as they've been told. But the other thing is, and I think this is especially true in Kenneth Thompson's victory in Brooklyn, he associated it with issues like stop and frisk and a lot of other concerns, that young people who were busted with a small amount of marijuana ended up being thrown into a legal system, and in fact there weren't that many full prosecutions, but it's just the idea that you were getting hit by that. And so what he said is, look, we're just not going to prosecute these. That is a signal to the police. It's a signal to the whole structure that let's stand down in this area. Let's stop using this perhaps as an excuse to hassle folks, and let's look at real crimes, at more serious crimes. I think that combination of factors, one, people who actually think this isn't as big a deal, and two, folks who think that this has really become a part of policing that we ought to be concerned about and ought to address, has created some very significant patterns of results across the country.
So what do you think, John, how does this relate, the results, what do they reflect about the changes in the national conversation politically on some of these crucial issues?
Well, I hope that the fracking referendums from Colorado will kind of feed up the political food chain. I'm not sure it will. The fact of the matter is...
and talk about this.
Well, we all know what fracking is. It's where you're kind of beating up the ground in order to kind of soften it up to get fuel resources out of it. And what you had in Colorado was some citizen referendums, some referendums on the ballot where people were given right to say, look, we don't want this here.
At least 3 of 4
yes,
banned fracking.
Yeah.
And then in Ohio, 1 of 3 banned fracking.
And at the grassroots across this country, this is a huge movement. I mean, there are people all over this country. And this is, I want to emphasize, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, when you got this in your neighborhood, you're concerned and you want to address it. And when people are given a right to vote on this, to weigh in, there's a lot of evidence that they really object. That's the kind of thing that ought to, again, feed up the political food chain. It ought to go to the legislatures. It ought to go to Congress. President Obama and others ought to hear this and recognize that as they advance energy policies, this notion that fracking should be a big part of our future energy policy in this country ought to be rethought. The people are saying that from the grassroots. There's so many things that the people try to say and try to get through this money and media election complex that is so hard to break through. And I think that today or yesterday what you saw was people are trying to say, we really want some different policies on the drug war. We would really like some different environmental and energy policies. That's coming up there. They clearly, I think there's no question they said, we want a different approach to austerity. Instead of cuts, we'd like to do different tax policies and actually look at, raising the wage floor, things of that nature. And my concern always is that so much of our media doesn't carry those messages up. And in fact, we sort of put a wall on these local referendums. And that's why I'm so glad we're talking today, because this is what we ought to do. We ought to look at elections as individual local events across this country, but we should also look for those patterns, those messages that come out. And I frankly think that Tuesday's elections sent quite a few important messages.
Well, John Nichols, we want to thank you very much for being with us. John Nichols is a political writer for The Nation. His new article is An Election About GOP Extremism, Unions, Wages, and Dollarocracy. And before we go, one last question about Alabama.
Yes. Huge battle in Alabama in a Republican primary between the Chamber of Commerce and the Tea Party. This is a play out of the shutdown. And it looks like the money power won. The Chamber of Commerce moved a lot of money into a district to try and nominate a guy who was a slightly more moderate conservative over a guy who is a very, very extreme right-wing candidate. And so you saw money prevail down there, it looks like, a money advantage. But we should also be conscious of the fact that this is really the beginning of a huge fight for 2014 for the soul of the Republican Party.